There are a collection of adverbs in Latin that I call the uber irregulars, and they are the Latin equivalent to our good, better, best. Just as we don't say good, gooder, goodest, the Romans are not going to say that either. And just as students of English need to memorize these strangely irregular adjectives, so too will you. I like to think of these adjectives in pairs. We've got good and bad, we've got big and small, and then multus is down here kind of on its own. And I also like to think of them as start with the positive, bonus and malus, and then hop over to the superlatives, because I think the English derivatives that go along with the superlatives are pretty easy to grasp, and then the comparatives can get a little tricky, especially here. But if you think of English derivatives and think of the kind of way I'm presenting them to you here, hopefully that'll help you remember these, because otherwise they can get a little confusing. So the way I like to teach the superlatives is bonus means good, and somebody who always expects a good outcome is an optimist. And the superlative of good, which means, very good or the best, is optimus. So an optimist comes from optimus, and the opposite of optimist is pessimist, and the opposite of optimus is pessimus. So the superlative of bad is pessimus. So the person that expects the worst outcome is a pessimist, and pessimus means very bad or the worst. Magnus means big, and if you make your profits as big as possible in a company, you maximize profits. And the superlative in Latin is maximus. And then the opposite of maximus, instead of maximizing, if you're trying to make something really small, you minimize, and the opposite of maximus is minimus. So again, if you think big, small, maximus, if you want to make your profits or you want to take advantage of your time, you maximize your time. If you want to minimize the amount of stress you cause your parents, you make it the stress you cause very small, and that would be minimus. Continuing on, let's focus on the comparative of big and small, because again, I think if you think of English derivatives, these are not too tricky. If you start with big, I like to think of this in terms of musical keys. There are major and minor keys, and minor keys are often smaller and understated, and major keys are big and bright and brash. And so let's look at small first. The comparative of small is minor. You can also think about a minor can't vote or can't drive. It is a smaller member of society. And then in Latin, well, in English we would say major, but then you have to remember that Latin doesn't have a J, so it becomes major. So the comparative of Magnus is major, but if you think about minor and major, whether the minor leagues and the major leagues of baseball, the smaller league and the bigger league, and then just remember that the major in Latin, that J becomes an I and it's major, then you're all set. Before we get to the hardest ones that are up here, let's do multus. Multus means much or many. If you have the comparative, which means more, it's actually plus. And this is a pretty complicated word. In the singular, it's a noun, and in the plural, it's an adjective. But don't worry about that for now. All you need to know is plus. If you think about plus in mathematics, if you're making something more than something else, you're adding to it, you're using the plus sign. And then the superlative is plurimus. It's related to the word plural, and it, was longer than plus. I think those are pretty easy to memorize. The toughest ones by far are the comparative of bonus, which is melior. And what's tricky about that is it looks a lot like major, and a lot of kids either forget about the L here or add an extra L here, so be careful with your spelling. And then the comparative of malus is payor. And the only way I can help kids remember this is by teaching them two 50-cent words, which is, there is an English word, ameliorate, which means to make a situation better or make something better. So if you can remember that ameliorate is to make a situation better, that might help you with melior. There is an English word, pejorative, which is usually used to refer to speech. Pejorative speech is kind of negative, bad speech. And if you can remember, just like with major, in Latin, they wouldn't have a J and it would be pejorative speech. And so that leaves us with peor as the comparative. But I would say, as far as memorization goes, these two are definitely the ones that you're going to have to memorize. The others, hopefully, you can see the correlations between the pairs, and it won't be too tricky to get all these down.